The Barna Group has just completed the largest study ever on religious freedom in America. It took 4 years to complete, and the results are astonishing. 3/4 of the U.S. clergy now believe religious freedom is becoming less valued in our country. And 2 out of 5 adults polled, 43%, say religious freedom is worse in America than 10 years ago. Well, joining us to share more polling insights is the president of the Barna Group, David Kinnaman. David, it's a pleasure seeing you and having you with us today. So, are we losing our commitment to the First Amendment to our Constitution? What surprised you the most about this study?
Well, one of the interesting things from the study, we were looking at the perspectives of pastors in the United States. We looked at both Catholic clergy as well as Protestant leaders. And as you mentioned, the vast majority of them are concerned about the state of religious liberty. They're concerned about the tone and texture of the conversations that happen around religion. And they're also concerned about how practicing Christians will be able to practice their faith in the future. Part of that was really interesting was they were actually concerned about how they preach and teach. We found that a vast majority of pastors say they are often constrained or limited in the way that they preach and teach in today's society. They actually feel pressured to not preach on certain topics or pressured to speak on topics that they're not ready to talk about.
Well, what are some of those topics they're telling you about?
Well, we found that certainly issues of sexuality, the LGBTQ community, and recognizing sort of how to talk about that from a biblical perspective, issues of morality, values, politics, consumerism, immigration. There's all this sort of pressure to speak out on issues or to not speak out on issues.
It seems like a lot of pastors are almost afraid to preach about sin, consequences of sin, preach about hell. I know there are concerns about the decline of traditional values and young people are dropping out of church. So tell us a little bit about that.
And one of the interesting things that we find in the research is that young people are often more willing to be challenged and to be pushed by the church than the church is willing to challenge them. And in fact, the things that we really learn about those who are resilient in their faith is they're actually taught about a lot of really deep theological truths. And we don't shy away from that in those churches that retain young people, that produce resilient discipleship. But it is certainly a more difficult environment. We see in the research that young people young Christians are telling us they feel afraid to speak up. They feel misunderstood, marginalized. It is a very difficult environment to grow up as a young Christian. And so we should acknowledge that and recognize that, but be all the more committed to teaching these young people the truth of Scripture.
Now, my understanding is this wasn't just about Christian opinions. You polled all faiths, did you, in America? Did you break down the concerns by various faith groups? Or say more Muslims, Jews, more concerned than Christians about religious freedom, or are they about the same?
Part of what we were trying to understand is religious liberty something that everyone is concerned about in the same ways? And we did find that Jewish and Muslim and other faith clergy leaders also are concerned about religious liberty as well. And I think this is an important thing, that if we're concerned about religious liberty for Christians, we also ought to be concerned about religious liberty for people of other faith groups. We found in the research among adults that there is this growing concern about religious liberty, although in the last 2 years under the Trump administration, that concern has been mitigated somewhat. But certainly when you speak to people in Christian higher education, when you talk about sort of the opportunities to sort of run institutions like adoption services and others in a very religiously plural culture, there's concerns about how will people's rights, how will these organizations, how will these churches, how will these colleges and universities, how will their rights to practice their religion, not merely to worship and to do the things in the church building, but how to practice those faith commitments out in the public square. Those are really, really large concerns that most people, they sort of feel it in the water, but they don't really know how to articulate it. And I think that's actually part of what we learned in this study was this growing sense that we need a better way forward when it comes to religious liberty in our times today.
Did any of them share with you on why they felt this was happening?
Well, when we talk to faith leaders, there is this sense that we actually looked at a whole range of things, like is it a concern about LGBT agenda? Is it concerns around other sort of faith groups pushing Christianity to the sidelines? And those were some of the concerns that Christian leaders talk about. And certainly there's a wide range of concerns. I mean, part of I think our current moment is that we're in a much more religiously plural environment. Christianity is not not as dominant as it used to be in American culture, and what can we do about sort of the concerns about this next generation. So how do we really articulate a way forward for Christianity in acknowledging that this is a different environment? In some ways, we actually think that it's a good news for Christianity have to be not just the only voice, but one of many voices in our society today. Of course, we hope other people would become Christians, but what does it mean for us to be part of a religiously plural culture? And how do we help to love people, even if we have differences? How do we have our conversations on social media? So when we talk about discipling this next generation, how can we teach them to think about their current cultural environment? I think about the story of Daniel in the Old Testament, this young leader who was in a pluralistic, religiously, weird world, and he was able to sort of think about his context and think about theological truths that he was holding to, his commitment to prayer, his commitments to relationships, his commitments to his public square, his role as a political leader within Babylon. And in a similar way, I actually hope that would be part of our experience as Christians today, is that we realize that we are in a type of new exile here in the United States. That can be a good thing in terms of our opportunities to minister and to be effective, but to recognize that this is a much more complex environment, and that the fight for truth isn't just going to be won with sheer firepower.
And the old saying from the persecuted church around the world, more persecution, more church growth. Okay, David Kinnaman, president of the Barna Group, thanks for sharing your insights.